Hello and welcome back to a new lecture on phonetics. In our last e-lecture we discussed the IPA symbols for the English language. But you may have noticed that there was a slight problem that we ran into. The sounds that we discussed, take for example this sound and this sound. Now you may have noticed that these two sounds sound very similar, especially to an American speaker. An example for this sound was hot, and for this sound was caught, hot, caught. There's a very slight difference even for an American speaker, but you can sense how difficult it is to define what each symbol really represents when it comes to sounds. What we need is a more methodological, more scientific way to define what this sound actually represents and what this sound represents and what all of the IPA sounds actually represent. To do this, we're going to need to make use of articulatory phonetics. We'll explain this in just a minute. But for now, what we need is for someone to tell us that this sound differs from this and that this sound is pronounced one way that is different from the way this one is pronounced. Alright? So then we have to look at how each one is articulated. So then articulatory phonetics is the study of how speech sounds are produced by the human vocal apparatus. In fact, the branch of phonetics can be divided up into three different parts, or three sub-branches. The first is the one we just described, articulatory phonetics. The second one is acoustic phonetics. And the third one is auditory phonetics. So basically we said that articulatory phonetics is concerned with how the sounds are produced using the human vocal apparatus. So we can say it is concerned with how sounds are produced. Acoustic phonetics looks at each sound and asks what are the physical properties of these sounds. So it looks at the sound waves for each sound. And so it looks at the physical properties. Last but not least, we also want to know how these sounds are perceived by our ears and our brain. How do we hear these sounds? How do we perceive them? How do we understand and analyze them? That is the task of auditory phonetics. Now, to understand what each IPA symbol actually represents and how each IPA symbol differs from the other, we're going to have to focus on articulatory phonetics to show the differences in how each sound is articulated. To do that, we're going to have to look at the organs of speech, okay, or what we call the articulators. This picture represents the articulators. So speech is produced by pushing air out through your lungs and up either your oral cavity or your nasal cavity. Now, along the way, the air being pushed up is modified at several different locations to create several different sounds. By identifying where each sound is modified and how it is modified, we are able to distinguish one sound from another. So let's begin by analyzing the organs of speech by talking first about the nasal cavity. The nasal cavity is the easiest one, and that's because as air passes up through the nasal cavity, nothing else can change or modify the airstream here. How do you know if you're producing a sound that had the air coming up through the nasal cavity? Try to close your nose completely and pronounce the letter K, like so. K, K. We can still pronounce it. Try to close your nose completely and pronounce M. It'll sound something like this. M. That's a huge difference. This one sounds very weird because to produce the M sound, air had to have come up through the nasal cavity. But to produce the K sound, air had to go up through the oral cavity. So as you can see, that's one way that we can distinguish between the sounds. So now that we got the nasal cavity done with, let's talk about everything else. So when we produce a sound, air pushes up through your windpipe. Air first passes through what we call the larynx. Inside of the larynx, are the vocal folds. The vocal folds. Sometimes we call them the vocal cords. And right in the middle of the vocal folds is a gap that we call the glottis. So this is the first place that air gets modified in. If air passes through the vocal folds without vibration, then the result is what we call a voiceless sound. But if when the air passes up through the vocal folds begin to vibrate, okay, then the result would be a voiced sound. What's the difference between a voiceless and a voiced sound? Here's a quick example. I want you to continuously say S, so you can do it with me. S. Now place your 2 fingers on your Adam's apple, which is somewhere around here on your throat. Do you feel any vibration? Now I want you to continuously pronounce Z. Again, placing your fingers on this area. Now you feel a ton of vibration. So just off of this small little detail, we are able to distinguish between 2 sounds, S and Z. Now we know that S is the sound that does not have vibration, and so it is voiceless. And we know that Z is a sound that does have vibration, and so it is voiced. Let's take another example. Try to produce the sound F continuously. There is no vibration, and so F is a voiceless sound. Try to produce V, and the result is you get a lot of vibration. So V is a voiced sound. There are 3 main ways that we can distinguish consonants. The first is whether the consonant is plus or minus voice. We've just seen a few examples of this. There are 2 more that we will talk about as we go through this lesson.